Hello again, and welcome to our panel dedicated to philosophical science, part of our Greetings Earthling program. Make sure you check out all of our sessions. For fans of Tolkien, you'll get the reference to the Flame Imperishable. That's his idea of the human spark. And in this program, generally we've explored extinction and existence made more urgent by the climate threat, making us quite perishable. It's perhaps most vivid in this particular panel. In this session, we have two writer-philosophers who join me in a brainy and challenging conversation about morality and humanism in the climate crisis. What are the ideas of being a human when we are faced with, in ways never before imagined in human history, of the lights going out? Before we get started, a special thank you to our critical and ongoing sponsors and private donors. As you know, Broto Art Climate Science is a program of the Cape Cod Center for Sustainability, which is a registered 501c3 charity. We have done this program online and for free. But that means we have to rely on our attendees to support us financially, especially for us tiny nonprofits in the COVID era when funding has evaporated. If you can help us, even with a small donation in support of this program and future Art Sci initiatives by Broto, please click the link in the pop-up. Now, on with our panel inspired by global citizenship. Thank you for watching. Welcome back, Earthlings, to day 2 of our conference on global citizenship, in which we'll be exploring the social sciences as a foil for art amid the climate crisis. My name is Ian Edwards, a producer and host. We have people from all over the world tuning in from over 30 countries, and our panelists this year this time are truly international: South Africa, Australia, Sweden, India, the UK, the US. UK is in the house tonight. All of us Earthlings, despite national affiliation. Broto Art Science, Climate Science looks at the collaboration of art and science in the climate impasse. And since 2018, we've been convening these unique sustainability conversations to both experiment with our model and then also to provide some new content in the world. Maybe not all the answers, but certainly better questions. The Greetings Earthling conference examines the human scale of the crisis. Philosophy is a go-to subject area, and it's all through the program, if you'll notice. What does it mean to be human? And so we're going to zero in on topics like existence and extinction and agency and privilege and justice. But here to continue our philosophical discussions are Melanie Challenger, a writer and award-winning poet and interdisciplinary artist focused on environmental history and humanity's relationships in nature. She is the author of a new book, How to Be Animal, A New History of What It Means to Be Human, just out. Do order it from your independent bookstore. It's a great book, Melanie. I just finished it. Kieran, Setiya, a professor of philosophy at MIT working on ethics and related questions about human agency and human knowledge. He is the author of Practical Knowledge, Reasons About Rationalism and Knowing Right from Wrong. And his forthcoming book, coming out next year, is excellent. Life is Hard, Philosophy for Troubled Times, which chapters about infirmity, loneliness, grief, failure, injustice, absurdity, and hope, with the focus on moral and existential challenge of climate change, catastrophic climate change, among other hardships. Look for it in the stores next year. And so after all of that, welcome to Broto. Thank you very much for your contributions in understanding our perishable state of humanness. This panel is called Flame Perishable, inspired by Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings and his universe of hobbits. He wrote about the Flame Imperishable, which for our viewers, that meant the unknowable spark of awareness of sapience that has been a philosophical riddle to our guests. From a philosophical point of view, has time run out for the human story? Is that different than a life to live point of view? Melanie, you want to start? Are we run out?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's I think what we're facing at the moment is seeing ourselves as finite, and we've gone through a lot of human history not seeing ourselves in those ways. So that's an existential challenge for us, and it's a psychological challenge. And it's also, of course, and I'm sure Kieran will speak to this because I know he's written about this, it's also moral challenge to us. So how do we ground morality in a finite moral journey that we're going on? So, you know, I when I was a lot younger, I wrote a book on extinction, and it was really looking at biocultural extinctions, and very much written from a young person's point of view. I was pretty young at the time, and I was really, in some ways, it was kind of an autobiography of the Anthropocene, of a person in their 20s coming to terms with this, and what I wanted to do as a young person was kind of trace both the intellectual and the historical and the industrial forces that had got us to this stage where we were facing a biodiversity crisis, where and there were all, you know, there was just extinctions everywhere around us. Now, one of the things that came out of that is that, you know, the concept of extinction has always been there in a mythical sense. So the flood, for instance, this flood that sort of washes away a bad time and ushers in a new time, is found all around the world, in cultures all around the world, and for thousands of years. So people have had in their imaginations this idea of a kind of wiping clean or of a termination. There's also been the idea of the last survivor. So the image of the last survivor, which we see, for instance, in something like Beowulf, where you have this last survivor of the tribe who sings to what it means to be the last person who, you know, or being of meaning in their world. So we've always squared up to it in our imaginations, but it was really only in this sort of 1700s and 1800s where the idea of geological time and this new way of thinking about time that wasn't any longer, let's say in Western imaginations, it wasn't any longer kind of a biblical time. This was a geological time, a deep time in which species would come and they would go. And right from the beginning, like as soon as it was resisted quite strongly, actually, but once the evidence became sort of unignorable anymore, you find this immediate buffering, this immediate kind of crisis where people have to, you know, really have to think about what this means for human existence. And I think we're still there now. So we're facing the sixth extinction, which has really only properly been in people's minds for, let's say, 30 years. I mean, people have been, you know, environmental philosophers and thinkers have been talking about this, and biologists for, you know, longer than that, certainly the last century. But it's properly got in people's minds only very recently. And so we're just now starting to figure out, how do we live a good life when cosmically, when biologically, it's possibly going to be brief. So I think that's what we're facing up to. And I think I'd like to hear Kieran speak about it. I think there's something that we can say about how you can ground yourself and live a good life, or sort of wrest goodness out of that. But it'd be nice to hear what Kieran thinks.
Yeah, I mean, I going back to the original question of whether time has run out, I hope not. I mean, I hope that there's still a way to imagine philosophically and realize practically a kind of viable future for humanity. And I mean, the other thing you sort of, Ian, when you sort of opened this, was sort of with the contrast between the philosophical and a kind of lived perspective. And I think there isn't really a clear contrast there. In a way, I think the philosophical point of view sort of has to be continuous with lived experience. And this is the kinds of things that Melanie is talking about are the ways in which sort of big ideas impact our experience of the world, and how much philosophical work is really not about abstract argument, but just trying to think through and articulate the world as it presents itself to us, sometimes in terms we already grasp and sometimes through sort of conceptual innovation. I mean, on the case of extinction in particular, and sort of how philosophy can grapple with that, I mean, one thing to say is that it's an area where standard kind of ways of thinking about value that have been influential in philosophy, but also in sort of wider public thinking and planning, seem to sort of run aground. So, you know, if you think, you know, from a utilitarian or cost benefit perspective, you might think, well, extinction's bad because it's better if there are just more happy people. The larger the population, the more opportunities there are for happiness and aggregating benefits over harms. And I think that way of thinking, sort of that cost-benefit approach, very prominent in public policy and very prominent in philosophy, really doesn't capture the historical temporal dimension of what's so disturbing about extinction. So, I mean, even if you think just about other species and are not yet focused on human extinction, I think it's really important that it's not as though when we worry and feel disturbed by the prospect of, I don't know, the extinction of polar bears, as if somehow that will be compensated for if other species would just reproduce more and there'd be just as many happy beings. I mean, there's a kind of attachment historically and temporally to the continuity of kinds of living things that is challenged by extinction. And that's a kind of value that sort of just drops out of cost-benefit analysis. And then, in the human case, we have a kind of reflexive version of that. We want, in a special way, for the human experiment to sort of continue into the future. And the prospect of extinction there is distinctively disturbing. I will say, I think it can be misleading or sort of distracting to focus on extinction only, as if, as it were, as long as we don't go extinct, the problem goes away. I think when you think about why extinction in particular is troubling, it has to do with things like the persistence and flourishing of art, science, and culture. So extinction on these smaller scales. I think Melanie mentioned sort of cultural extinction. I mean, that's a kind of form of extinction that we face, even if, as it were, humanity survives. And I think it's also important that it's not just about sort of what matters is not just sort of persistence, that we want to survive somehow. There's also, I think, part of our investment, I think, is or should be in the survival of humanity through change. And part of what will be so awful about the extinction of humanity in the near future would be that we would go extinct in a state of such sort of immaturity, really, that we would go extinct at a point where our progress towards any kind of broader social justice would have been so limited. And that part of our investment in the future of humanity is an investment, and should be an investment, in a more just future. And that, I mean, part of why climate change is so terrifying is not just that it involves kind of injustice itself, like the injustice of the US and the West, and to some extent China, sort of using resources in ways that then will inflict harm on those who've contributed so much less to the crisis. It's also that it threatens to bring out the worst in us, like to bring out resource conflicts and crises of migration, immigration, and make sort of social justice, racial justice in those kinds of contexts even harder to achieve. So there's a way in which, tackling the climate crisis is not just an aspect of trying to make our way towards a more just future, but it is going to sort of have implications for all of the other dimensions of justice in which we might care about and be invested in the human story, as you put it, sort of not running out.
What factors go into the separateness from nature, or the separate from being animal? And when did it begin, and how do we get back?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to summarize this kind of stuff, because my work is a lot about showing the complexity, and it is very confusing for us morally, and I don't know that there are easy routes out. So on, and a lot of this is about just pinning down what we're talking about semantically. So, for instance, what are we quite talking about when we talk about nature, or what are we talking about when we talk about what progress might look like? Because, when we were talking about extinction, for instance, and, trying to resist that biologically is obviously different to trying to resist that, in terms of what, to live a life of meaning. Now, when it comes to nature and trying to bring us back together with nature. You know, on the one hand, we already are back with nature. I mean, human beings are animals. They are still needing everything from their environment and influencing their environment. They're still behaving as beings trying to keep homeostasis. They're trying, as subject to the laws of thermodynamics, all of these sorts of things. We haven't escaped in any way, shape or form. So we're really talking about several things that can get collapsed down. As societies, part of the estrangement comes from not having a direct relationship to the natural forces that you're influencing. So just in purely pragmatic and practical terms, pre-industrial societies had to work with their resources directly, and often paid for those physically in their bodies. So they were harvesting with their bodies rather than and less so with tools. And we can see what a difference that makes in terms of how you manage your resource with something like the fishing industry, or with the emergence of combine harvesters and things like that, and how you're able to release or capture a lot more energy or resources, but you're at a big distance and you're not paying the same kind of physical price for it. And that has an effect on how people are able to rationalize their impact, and therefore how they're able to shift their behaviors. So that kind of estrangement, which is partly a technologically enforced one, is quite easy to kind of track and talk about. The psychological or the cultural estrangement from nature is very variable across societies, very different, across time, and harder to talk to. But certainly there has been in modern societies, within modern civilization, once the numbers of us get large. So in large societies, we can see different kinds of ways in which people, societies and cultures have tried to solve the meaning of human existence. And I think the estrangement that I'm often very interested in is the moral estrangement. So the way in which we try to separate ourselves out, and there's different forms of human exceptionalism, essentially, to say that we are not nature, that we are above nature, that we should control nature, or that we have dominion over nature, these sorts of ideas that come in lots of different forms, but all are trying to achieve the same aim, which is that the natural world appears to be amoral, very complex, and quite threatening to us. And therefore, to build our moral systems of justice, we prefer not to think about it and to separate ourselves out from it. And I think we can see that, and we can track that through lots of different stages through history, and we haven't resolved it to the present day. That is still an open question. I think, to speak to what Kieran was saying, my heart's with Kieran, because I also share aspects of moral philosophy. Reality is just there. We have to create it, and we do to a certain extent artificially create it when it comes to our ideas about what progress is. There are some philosophers, people like John Gray, for instance, who would argue progress is just an absolute illusion, that it doesn't really have any meaning. So I think when we talk about morality and what we ought to do and how we can repair it, I think we can't duck the fact that we have to have some very difficult and complex questions about what kind of being we are and what relationship we ought to have with other beings, and that it's not easy to pull good out of that and to understand what the right thing to do is. I still think a lot of that work needs to be done.
The other thing that I've noticed in the climate crisis versus the COVID crisis is that there might be a difference in adversity, to get to Kieran's book. The idea that adversity could be acute or chronic, and that the acute issues of existence get addressed like right now, and that the climate crisis just has a kind of a thrum in the background and sort of is always there and sort of doesn't get dealt with because it's too big and too abstract. Anything in your upcoming book, Kieran, that might explain some of the difference between acute and chronic crises?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, this is the sort of frog in the slowly heating water phenomenon, right? That we sort of adapt to the ways in which climate change is making life harder, and our adaptability is a kind of wonderful thing, but to the extent that it sort of perennially puts us off from realizing that this is a crisis, we're in trouble, and that it's difficult enough for us to think 5-10 years ahead, given the kind of political structures in which we live and the kind of urgency of human needs right now. Thinking in in the kind of geological terms that Melanie was pointing to, that climate change sort of makes vivid, is something that's very difficult for us. I mean, there is a kind of relation here to the kind of history of human exceptionalism that Melanie's written so insightfully about, which is that we tend to focus, when we sort of make ourselves exceptional, on features that seem in some way to be valorized, like the soul or rationality or self-consciousness, and less on features like our short-sightedness that make us particularly vulnerable, or our capacity for cruelty, or our capacity for indifference. And I think one kind of way in which the issues about morality here get really complicated, again, Melanie was pointing to this, is on the one hand, the sort of valorizing of our rationality or self-consciousness sort of divorces us from nature. On the other hand, it often goes along with a kind of resistance to what philosophers like Peter Singer called speciesism, the idea that we are, as a species, somehow specially distinct from nature. I mean, philosophers who valorize rationality or self-consciousness often end up sort of emphasizing the continuity between human infants or humans with severe cognitive disabilities and sort of cognitively sophisticated non-human animals. And in cases like that, the implications of emphasizing our continuity with non-human animals can be quite disturbing. I mean, I'm sort of moral bedrock. I think that cognitively disabled human beings have a kind of significance that wolves or pigs don't have. And so I think that's one of the points at which this sort of question about continuity raises moral issues that are extremely difficult to untangle. And there's a kind of distinction here that philosophers make that I find useful, which is a distinction made by a philosopher called Steve Darwell between appraisal and recognition respect, where appraisal respect is the kind of respect that you give to someone when you say, yeah, respect, you're great at that. You have a real talent. And recognition respect is the respect that involves sort of acknowledging dignity. I think it's really important to divorce those two, to sort of divorce the recognition respect, the sort of acknowledgement of the dignity of human beings, even infants, even those with severe cognitive disabilities, from the idea of a kind of special positive appraisal of human beings, that we're somehow better than the rest of nature, or that we have some kind of merit that sets us apart from the rest of nature. And so even though I think I'm probably, I don't know, Melanie can say whether this is true, I might be more committed to the idea of a kind of moral distinctiveness of human beings than she is. I think it's very easy to misunderstand what that kind of moral distinctiveness could be in ways that involve sort of illusions about our own value, and sort of illusions about the insignificance of the rest of nature, or not sort of non-human animal suffering. I also want to go back to something she said at the start, which seemed totally right to me, which is that in a way, the idea that we're separate from nature and that it's so deeply misleading, in that part of how human beings live is by sort of changing the world around them in ways that are often quite dramatic. And that isn't a sort of new thing, even if it is taking sort of new and disturbing forms right now. So another risk here, I think, that we should be careful to avoid is sort of, not that either of you have fallen into it, but there's a sort of risk of romanticizing a kind of primitive past in which humans lived somehow in harmony with the natural world, as though our constant changing of the world around us hasn't been part of sort of human life for as long as there has been human life. None of this is to offer sort of simple answers to the questions Melanie was raising, but I do think that there's a kind of real challenge of how to acknowledge in a morally meaningful way our continuity with nature without giving up on the kind of distinctive moral significance, even of human beings who sort of lack the kinds of intrinsic capacities that have been traditionally sort of valorized?
I think we cannot duck the messiness from which we have emerged, and we want to do it. And every time we're trying to find the good, we are going to have to face this anew, these sorts of questions. And they aren't easy to answer, and they're never going to be straightforwardly answered. But a lot of ethicists, for instance, are extremely resistant to any kind of naturalizing of morality. I'm the exact opposite of that. I think very much as if I was a biologist. And actually, that has been the great fear of morality. And it's the great fear of looking at extinction. You know, when I was doing all of my extinction stuff, I had so many people who would come to me and say, well, yeah, but if everything's going to, you know, extinction is just natural and it's all going to happen anyway, so what's the point, kind of thing. You hear that sort of thing a lot. The people, you know, the naturalistic fallacy, we've always been taught, you know, we can't get anything good, you know, or see what we ought to do from how something is. And all of these sorts of ideas are different responses to what can suddenly feel very troubling about the way in which our moral systems have emerged from an amoral world. We are naturally moral, and therefore that's quite helpful to soothe some of those continuity issues. We can see quite clearly that while moral norms may be very, very different and are to a certain extent sometimes frustratingly flexible, because, you know, people can have moral norms that to us seem really horrifying in some cultures if they're strapped to a sort of cultural idea that we don't, you know, about women, let's say, that we don't agree with or what have you. You know, moral norms are widely flexible because they need to change with the circumstances. That's sort of baked into, of course, how something would be. But kind of the, you know, and this is a bit kind of Jonathan Haidt's foundations theory, but you don't have to really agree with that to just at least accept that there are certain things that we do see over and over again, even in tiny hunter-gatherer communities or in vast societies. You know, there are all sorts of taboos about, you know, killing. There are ways of thinking, recognizing the signals of distress from others, recognizing signals of agency and expression and intention in others. One of the big differences, of course, is that in hunter-gatherer communities or in animistic worldviews, those have been extended often to the animals being hunted, for instance. So there's a widely accepted, you know, it's widely accepted that other beings have value and intention and agency and spirit, to which one responds morally. That's almost absent in the Western tradition to this day. But you know, I think what we can recognize is that human beings need to flourish morally as well as physically. They need to feel that they are living a good life. Otherwise, they do suffer. And we can see this. And that's as true of anyone in a small society or a large society. And also, we can see what moral agency is often doing in human beings. And we are creatures with moral agency, and not all animals have moral agency. They solve problems about interactions, but it doesn't take the form of the kind of moral agency that we have. So, for instance, recognizing unfairness, recognizing either through language or an individual without language, just through expressions, the fact that we have whites of the eyes to track gaze, understand the feelings, the expressions on someone's face, the fact that expressions are often very universal, you know, are all signs that we have evolved. We are adapted to live in a moral world. And therefore, you know, for instance, the idea that, you know, a gorilla is a lesser being, I think is wrong. It's just the wrong point of view. Gorillas need to flourish on their terms. They express what they need quite clearly to us, and we can respond to those. They don't need to flourish with the kind of moral terms that we do. Therefore, you know, we have to, when we're seeing either or between them or us, we're just missing the fact that our flourishing is different to their flourishing, and that therefore will result in totally different duties, totally different actions towards another human than to a gorilla. But it doesn't mean the gorilla doesn't have value, you know, or feeling or expressions. It just means that we don't need to respond to them. We don't need to give them a funeral or do all of the sorts of things that we might do with a human being, because they're not living in our kind of they're not flourishing through that kind of way of thinking about themselves, that sort of self-identity. So, and that helps again when we think about climate change, because realistically we're eventually human societies will end, and nobody will read any of the great poets from the world, and the torch will go out. We aren't the elves who are going to keep the flame going forever in the Tolkien world. We will draw to an end at some point in time, as will the earth, as will the cosmos. But I think the point here is that we still are left with, on the scale of an individual human life and on the scale of our societies, with the absolute need to morally flourish in our lifetime.
People talk about the climate crisis because it is urgent, but the lag times involved are just, in terms of the kind of ongoing effect, the sort of baked in effects of past emissions, for instance, just really hard for people to get their heads around. And so I think there's a kind of role there for moral ideas that help us to sort of bring back into focus our imaginative and ethical investment in the survival of humanity, and maybe also in some of the things that Melanie was pointing to, which is, I think, that even if we think of ethics as somehow grounded in some complicated way in human nature, that sort of at the bottom of this is the fact that we are ethical beings. We're beings that have a kind of reflexive, evaluative, ethical investment in ourselves. We also have a kind of ethical, evaluative, reflexive investment in our relation to nature, and in parts of nature that we don't immediately, that we're not sort of using for our own purposes. So I think there are resources there for thinking sort of ethically about what is at stake in climate change that could motivate people. But I think the fundamental sort of practical problem, how do you get people to care, is it sort of has two levels. One is how do you get people to care enough about the sort of future and about nature. The other is how, once they care, do you make things change? And one of the kind of frustrating features of the current political dispensation is that actually, even in America, where climate denialism is as rife as it is anywhere in the world, like the Yale Climate Change Communication Project is sort of tracking attitudes.
Right.
In fact, the vast majority of Americans do believe that climate change is real, that it's dangerous. They care about it. They think it's happening. They think it's caused by human activity. They care about their children and grandchildren's, the world into which they'll live. So we could make progress on that for sure. But the deeper, and I think most sort of frustrating problem, is the disconnect between pretty widespread desire for action on the part of many people, a sort of manifestation of their investment in the future through, for instance, their children or their friends' children, or it's just sort of more abstract concern for human survival and a kind of more sort of equitable relationship to the rest of the natural world. It's very hard to make political headway in making in sort of affecting change, given the sort of economic and political power of the fossil fuel industry, I mean, primarily. And so I think that's a kind of further side to this, is how we have organized ourselves socially and politically so that even very widespread, a deep widespread sense of urgency has a very hard time making an impact on political decision making. And that's a kind of another side of this, the sort of problem of how to think about the sort of barriers put up by the way, I guess, human nature, but by the way that human beings live now, to the kinds of urgent changes that we need to make.
One of the creative projects, thought experiments that I'm grappling with is whether society is a friend or a foe to our ongoing existence, and whether, you know, the humans that Descartes and Aristotle were thinking about still exist, if we're the same animal that we were 1,000 years ago. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it does seem like when you're talking about political systems and cultural systems, that you are putting the focus on the remedy on institutions that may not have the same self-interest as we do, as an ongoing thing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a kind of this question of whether the same humans sort of brings up a distinction that I think you find in Marx between human nature in the sense of sort of the essence of the human species, sort of something that is transhistorical, and sort of the anthropological question of how human beings live, where that's something that varies historically. You sort of imagine a Martian arriving on Earth, an intelligent Martian arriving on Earth, and there's a kind of biological description of human beings in which we're the same species we were 100,000 years ago. And then there's an anthropological description of how we live, on which the answer would be very different now than it was when we were hunter-gatherers, you know. And so and I think sort of Marx is broadly right that the kind of human nature that matters morally and politically is much more the anthropological one, the kind of question of how we actually live, rather than sort of the bare minimum required for membership in the human species. And how we live now is in a society sort of structured by the accumulation and extraction of wealth, a kind of way of living that puts us in competition with one another as individuals, also puts us in competition socially, creates racial conflict, class conflict, and puts us in this sort of unsustainably exploitative relation to the natural environment. And in that sense, you know, we're not the same human beings. We're not the same humans who Aristotle was writing about. And again, this is pessimistic, I suppose. It's not a solution. It's just that part of the problem is that we need to change how we relate to one another and to the environment, how we live. But it's very hard to believe that we're going to be able to make the kinds of changes radical enough to address the crisis fast enough. I mean, you know, if you think, you know, there is a kind of crisis in the structure of capitalism and its exploitation of the environment that we're becoming aware of, changes in that structure are just much, much slower than the development of the crisis. And so I think there is a kind of need to change how we live that is going to come much more slowly than whatever piecemeal patchwork enables us, you know, I hope, to make our way through what's happening right now.
While you were talking, I was thinking a lot about time. And so, you know, you've written quite a bit about sort of philosophy of action, and or in simpler terms, you know, how we act and the reasons that we act, and what, you know, what that is in you know, what's going on in that situation. So I worked on the whaling industry for quite a long time, and I met everyone from people who'd been involved in industrial whaling through to Inuit hunters who very different kind of you know, some of the elders in Nunavut who were some of the last people who remembered, you know, that kind of way of life where they would hunt bowhead whales in a very communal way, and as the only way to survive in that landscape. And there's lots of ways we can talk about this. So the first thing is, in terms of, you know, the transhistorical idea, you know, when we spend time with individuals who come from communities that still have vestiges of a much earlier way of life to which all humans would have experienced life, which is where you can't go to the supermarket and get your food. Nobody's making your food miles away through industrial processes. You've actually, and for, you know, Inuit, you know, communities, for instance, you know, they're living at the bare threshold of where it's possible for humans as a species, for Homo sapiens to survive, so that their foods and everything are really at the kind of really difficult. I mean, it's incredible, absolutely mind-blowing that they developed the technologies to survive in those sorts of landscapes, because they're way outside of our comfort zone, which is kind of California for Homo sapiens, really. And consequently, you get a little window into what that was like, and of course you still see moral behavior at work, not only within the communities but also in terms of natural knowledge and the sacralizing of kind of taboos to guide action, to give reasons to act in ways that are sustainable in the landscape. That said, if we track Homo sapiens, even pre-speciation to Homo sapiens, you are seeing a species that goes in and takes out large mammals that compete in the landscape and drives them to extinction. You are, I use this a lot, but it is always mind-blowing that we are now at the smallest mammal sizes that there have been since the dinosaurs walked the earth. And that's us doing that. So as an animal, we tend to fight our immediate competitors, probably human ones, because we are an outlier. We're the only one there. One has to ask questions about how that came about. And large mammals in our environment. We have always done that sort of thing. That means that in terms of our moral behavior, we're building on top of that kind of architecture, and it does, we are predators as well, which is always a problem for our morality. We're not herbivores, we're omnivorous, but we're predatory, and that's always it's going to make having a sustainable relationship with the landscape and other species always quite challenging for us. So it's very complex when you look at it from what we are as our nature, and obviously species change, including human beings, over time. But we're also a cultural animal, and our cultures change, and our cultures and technologies have given us industrialization, and how that affects us is very, very different. And the tools you would need to resolve those are very, very different now. So I think about whaling again. One thing when I studied industrial whaling that was very interesting was that most of the guys on the kind of front line who were hauling these enormous creatures out and getting on top of the platforms and chopping them up and, to do the horrible, horrible work and very hard, were absolutely knackered, enthralled to an economic system where they were doing the best that they could to just bring money home. But ultimately, the money was being dealt with miles away in the comfort of a country 1,000 miles away for that matter, because this is the Antarctic we're talking about. The men who might have stopped and thought, I'm not going to kill the last of these blue whales in these waters, were certainly unsure about what they were doing. So they were literally doing it, and they were unsure about what they were doing. But they were utterly powerless and knackered. They were so tired that they couldn't think. They were, completely, their whole system stripped them of the ability to act with reason and responsiveness to their situation. Meanwhile, those who drove those species, because it made more money, made sense to drive them to extinction because they could make capital on them, were not in any sort of landscape that might have given them reasons to act differently, and were only in a landscape that gave them a lot of reasons to keep doing something deeply unsustainable. This is our first, oil industry boom and bust, because the decision making was at such a remove. So the sorts of tools that you would require, which are much more about the anthropology, much more about the kind of the social conditions and structures and institutions that facilitate very bad decision making and thinking, certainly need to be tackled in quite a different way to how we might think about encouraging the best parts of our morality.
Melanie, I'm gonna cut us off there, and we're going to alert our viewers that we're going to pop up and do some live Q&A and carry on some of this conversation. It's a very, very complex issue, obviously, and you guys are rooted in it. So I'm excited to continue in a moment. So stand by, and we'll be live in a second. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the live portion of our show. Thank you to Melanie and Kieran for that very deep conversation. And for our people who are on the Pacific time, that's pretty heavy conversation with your coffee. So thank you for all of that. First of all, it's been a couple of weeks since we did that recording. Is there anything that you saw or have thought of since that we should be mentioning in terms of some of the topic and your content?
Kieran?
I feel like there's so much more we could say, but I'm happy to, if Melanie is, to just
well,
look at people's questions and go.
I noticed Anna's dropped in a really good, maybe a good one to go with first, maybe.
Of course. We are talking about a good life. Could the panelists talk about what's a good life?
Melanie, are you gonna, since you picked the question, okay, I feel like I'll let you answer that one.
I've been thinking about this a lot. You know, what is good? Because we've been all of those discussions were about how we pull meaning out of life again and how we re-engage with. So up to now, like we could say, for instance, I'll tell you where I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of Florida, right? So before the pandemic, very keen naturalist, and my family and I were in Florida. And my son is really into orchids, and we were trying to see the orchids, you know, and they're epiphytic, so they kind of grow on the trees, and they've all been they get slashed off, and which is firstly an example of a completely impoverished kind of sense of natural knowledge that people have now, because of course you can't slash an epiphytic a creature that requires that specific organisms and network. You can't plant it in your garden, it will just die. So it shows you the madness of it all. But it's also this idea that a good life is all about controlling nature. So in Florida, all of these gardens are incredibly controlled. The water system is falling to rack and ruin because the waters will be diverted to create this kind of controlled, neat environment. And the nature's all kind of kept away safely in kind of Everglades. And also it's about the accumulation of wealth, of acquiring this orchid. This is going to make my life prettier and so forth. My gardens, this is the idea of my human garden, of my ideal of what a good life is. I think we're at the point where, and obviously that's very variable in different countries around the world, I'm assuming that, but just to talk to that specific example, in the end, we've got to reimagine what a good life is in a way that takes on board what we now know about the harms and costs that have followed from what we've determined as good up to now. And I know that's a really simple point, but I think each of us as individuals has to do that work now. We can't pretend we don't know the consequences of our action. So I think the first step is to reimagine what a good garden looks like, a good life looks like. You know, maybe a good garden is a messier garden now with more animals and less water diverted to us. And we just have to reimagine what that looks like as individuals. And then to think about what a good life is, what it is to bother to do good. Because I think one of the dangers with the Anthropocene and the idea of extinction and so forth is that one of the things that people talk about is that what's the point? You know, if we're all going to die, and if it's all going to come to nothing, why even bother to morally live a good life? And for that, I think we need to tell new kinds of stories about, you know, we touched on this earlier, about what progress looks like, and as I was saying, at the scale at which doing good is. And so, yeah, that would be my first sort of off the cuff answer. I don't know what you think, Kieran.
Kieran, do you have an idea of what a good life is?
I could say something sort of more, a bit more abstract than that, just about philosophically how I would approach the question. I feel like it has something in common with what Melanie said, in that I think a good way to start tackling it is to say something about what a good life is not, and sort of misconceptions about a good life. So, you know, if you think about the sort of an idea of a kind of hedonistic idea of the good life is just a matter of pleasure and absence of pain, and that is sort of an impoverished picture. Is, you know, philosophers point out by using these funny thought experiments where you imagine someone in a simulation machine having a simulated life in which it's as if they're doing all the things we might want to do in life, but they're just alone in a vat plugged into with electrodes in their brains. And it seems like you can have as much pleasure and as little pain as you like and still not really even be living a life. And another kind of, I think, sort of big picture conception that I think is really deeply wrong and has been profoundly influential is the kind of picture of the good life as just getting what you want, a kind of picture that arises in kind of gets influential in the sort of early modern period and sort of the early when economics becomes a discipline and remains central to an awful lot of sort of economic thinking about life. And really, I think what we need to do is go back to thinking about the good life in slightly old-fashioned terms that connect with what Melanie said in terms of virtue, but a conception of virtue that's sort of broad enough to include moral virtue, but also includes the kinds of ways in which the parts of our life where we're not really thinking about moral obligations can go well or badly. We can fail and succeed to different degrees in our lives. I mean, when I think about the sort of misconception of just getting whatever you want, I think about Bartleby in Melville's short story, who says, "I prefer not to." He prefers not to eat anything but ginger nuts, and he prefers not to do his job anymore. He prefers not to leave the office, and he kind of gets whatever he wants. But this is not a kind of good life. And the problem with that is not that he's not meeting his moral obligations. It's that things actually matter and that he's not responding to what actually matters. I mean, the story there is very interesting, too, because it sort of suggests a kind of structural, systemic reason why Bartleby is unable to find what matters. But yeah, that's where I would start in thinking about a good life, to think of recovering visions of what matters that go beyond just pleasure and pain or getting what you want, and think in terms of virtue and value, including morality, and make those things that sort of ways of talking that are viable, defensible, and that we don't feel embarrassed to use.
I just was reminded of something that Melanie said, and both of you touched on this in some way. Melanie said that we are naturally moral species, and you talked about how difficult it is to get a large number of people to care. And one of the things that I've struggled with, and this is why we're talking to experts and we have a general audience, is that climate denialism seems to be at its very basic level an immoral place to be for a society. And while we have the majority of people who believe in climate science, we don't act on it. And if we are naturally moral, how do we reconcile that with the fact that we aren't acting substantively on climate?
Well, I mean, one thing to say, sorry, just that there's naturally moral and there's naturally prone to actually get things right, or naturally prone to take in information. So, I think the reason why climate denial is an effective strategy for fossil fuel companies is that it makes people think that there isn't really a moral pressure to do anything because it's not as bad as people are saying. So Melanie, I didn't mean to interrupt, so I'm going to let Melanie say what she was.
No, not at all. I'd gone off on a slightly different thought process, because I was thinking about, good often follows from what a good relationship looks like. And, you can look really kind of macro in terms of what does a good human as a species, what does a good human relationship look like with the rest of nature? Whose point of view are you taking? Like our point of view, where we get all of the resources, woo, or the other point of view where all of the species, we're getting massive collapses in abundance, diversity, gene pools, all sorts in other species, and lots of species being used and killed, and having a fairly wretched time. So there's working out what a good relationship looks like. And then I was thinking at the kind of local level within human lives, that obviously, and someone spoke to, I think Gabriella said something along these lines, that, obviously human beings have had different ways of thinking about what good relationships looks like for our societies. So we some societies obviously are very individualistic, and it's not so much, it is about individual fulfillment, and that to a certain extent is a micro version of some idea of a exceptional human fulfillment, you know, of what a good life looks like. But in other societies, obviously you get collectivist models, which is different again, and more kind of an economic and social system. But then you also get maybe an indigenous worldview, something that's much more about it's much more egalitarian, and that might much more be about the relationships within that specific community, which will be a very small community of individuals. And you know, it's very difficult. A good looks quite different in all of those different contexts, you know.
Well, go ahead. Sorry. Well,
no, it's a real challenge for large individualistic, you know, large democracies, large industrial societies that have pursued a very individualistic way of imagining what a good human life looks like. You know, there's going to be inevitably a lot of resistance, and someone mentioned that with the pandemic, that we're seeing that people are kind of wanting to get back to the old normal quite fast if they can, you know. So we have to create within our social structures opportunities to nurture and support transitions. They will not happen fast, and you shouldn't do them through threat. So you need to find nurturing structures in big industrial societies to support a change like that, I think.
I'm going to wrap us for this part. I want to say thank you to Melanie and Kieran for what is the brainiest panel that we've had for a long time. And certainly up to our Broto challenging content. I actually think that this is a central question that we'll continue to ask again and again, as you know, working in a day-to-day. To our viewers, we do have a post-panel meeting space set up. You're welcome to go into this after this closes and continue the conversation. In the meantime, I really appreciate the wisdom you bring to this and the context, and thank you very much for your goodwill.
Thank you for having us.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Maybe see you in the meeting room.